I appreciate taking time out of your schedule to join us for this period of Bible study. For a few moments today, let's look at the parable of the talents. This is probably a familiar parable to many of you. It is found in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Now, since that is several verses, we will not take the time to read all those verses. But in this parable, we find Jesus is talking about a master who gives some of his money to three of his servants. Now, we call it the parable of the talents because a talent in that day and time would primarily be referring to a amount of money, a fairly large amount of money. Today, we normally use the word talents in reference to abilities. The point is really the same, and that is whatever we have is due to God. And that whatever we have is to be carefully used in service to God. It might be our money, it might be our abilities, it might be our influence. Whatever we have that God has given us, then we are to use it in service to God. And that's what this parable is really teaching us. So let's look at this parable for a few moments and notice what its lesson for us today is. One thing we see is that ability plus opportunity equals responsibility. You know, we all have certain abilities. No, it's not equal. You know, some people have more abilities than others, but we all have some ability. We all have opportunity because we all have the same 24 hours a day. Therefore, each one of us has responsibility to use our abilities in service to God. The main thing is the use of our talents, the use of our abilities, the use of our money, whatever it might be. That's the important thing, and not necessarily just the number or the amount of our abilities or amount of money that we have. You see, everything we have ultimately belongs to God. We are simply stewards then. And God requires us to be faithful in our service to Him. Great intellect, great brilliance, great education, and so forth are not required. But each servant is to be judged based on his faithfulness. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 2, Paul says that moreover it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. Now, in that context, Paul was really referring to the gospel and how he said we've been entrusted with the gospel. Therefore, since God has entrusted the gospel to us, we are steward to God in regards to the gospel. But again, the same principle would be given to anything. We talking about money or abilities. We are simply stewards of God. And there's going to come a day when account must be given. Just as in this parable, the master gave these talents to money to these individuals, and then he went away for a while. But one day he came back. And when he came back, then he required an accounting from each of his servants as to how they used the money that he had given them. Well, we need to remember that one day we're going to have to give an account to God too. We're going to give an account to God how we use whatever God has given to us. Many verses and throughout Scripture points this out, but let's notice just one. Romans 14 and verse 12. So then each one of us shall give account of himself to God. Here Paul very clearly said one day there's going to come a time when each one of us will stand before the judgment seat of Christ and God, and we will give account of our lives. We will give an account of what God has given us and how we used it. And we know that Jesus will reward faithful stewardship. Notice Jesus will reward faithful stewardship. We need to keep that in mind. You see, God demands our best. Partial obedience or half-hearted service will not be tolerated. Two of the three individuals servants. They each gained 5 and 2 talents respectively. They all went out and worked, and they gained more rewards. And therefore the master then rewarded them for their efforts. And notice that the reward was exactly the same for both of the individuals. Even though the 5-talent man earned more talents than the 2-talent man, the reward was the same. You see, good and faithful were the only qualities that mattered. Brilliance, ability, or anything else was not required by the master, only that we be good and faithful. And that is something that each one of us can do. That's why we do not need to be worried about what others have done, and we do not need to compare ourselves to what others have done, because we're going to be judged individually. They may have more abilities than we, or we may have more abilities than they do. Therefore, God may require more from us than he would others, simply because we have more abilities. Just as God expected more from the 2-talent man than he did the 5-talent man, more than he did the 2-talent man. Yes, one day God will reward us for our faithful stewardship. Notice one verse in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 8. Here the Apostle Paul said this right towards the end of his life. He said, "Finally there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord the righteous judge will give me at that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Here we find the promise from God through Paul that God will reward each one of us as long we are faithful in our stewardship. As long as we love and look forward to the appearing of Jesus Christ, we can rest assured God will reward us. But on the other hand, God will reject and punish an unfaithful steward. The 5 and 2-talent men, they were very faithful in their service to their master, and they were rewarded. But this master also gave 1 talent to one individual, and he did nothing except give excuses. When the master came back and asked him to give an account, notice what it says in verse 24. Then he who received the 1 talent came and said, "Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sowed, and gathering where you have scattered seed. And I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours." You see, this servant's first reaction was basically to blame someone else. He tried to blame his master for his lack of effort, for his lack of work, because he said the Lord was greedy. The master was unreasonable. He was simply looking for a mistake. He was looking for the impossible. Why, he was looking to gain something when he had done nothing. He was looking for the impossible. This man looked upon his master as one who oppressed the poor and the unfortunate. He expected others to do all the work for him, and then the master just simply get the rewards. That's what the servant said. And the servant then said, "Well, I was afraid." He was afraid that he would fail. You see, he did not have faith in his own abilities. He did not have faith, certainly, in the master. He blamed everyone but himself. But then in verse 26, we find the judgment of the master on his efforts. Notice in verse 26, "But his Lord answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy servant." Notice he calls him a wicked and lazy servant. There was no immorality. There was no disobedience. As far as we know, the servant had done exactly nothing that was wrong, other than the fact that he did nothing. You see, this servant was simply lazy. But on the basis of doing nothing, the master calls him wicked and unprofitable, or wicked and lazy. The others succeeded because they worked. This man failed because he refused to do anything. You know, all of us I'm sure realize that active involvement in sin is sinful. And we know that as long as we live the life of sin, that we will go to hell and will be punished. And we don't blame God for doing that. But we need to realize that lack of effort is just as sinful. James chapter 4 verse 17, James said, "Therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin." Well, that gets a lot of us, doesn't it? Many times we know what we should be doing. I have a feeling this one servant master, man, he knew what he should be doing too. He knew he should have went out and worked, but he was too lazy to do anything. We need to realize that lack of effort or doing nothing is also sinful. And a lack of effort will also cause us to be punished as well. You see, this tells us the Lord's view of religious indifference. That is, religion who does not really mean much to us. Many people, they claim to believe in God, and I'm sure to some extent they do, but they're not willing to really serve Him. They're not really willing to dedicate their life in service to Him. Well, God would call them lazy. God calls them religious indifferent. In this one servant master man, the master called him wicked. He called him unprofitable, verses 25 and verse 30. He also called him slothful or lazy. The word unprofitable means worthless. You see, if we are lazy, not only are we wicked in regards to God, God said we are worthless. If we fail to use our abilities in service to God, God says that we are lazy. Not only lazy, we are worthless. I doubt many of us, if any of us, would really call ourselves worthless. We all think that we're valuable. We all think we're important, and too many times we can be important. But we need to remember that if we're not using our lives and our abilities in service to God, then as far as God is concerned, we are worthless. What good are we? We're not doing anything for God. If we fail to use our abilities for God, we are worthless. You see, being lost then is easy. People like to think that if we do some great deeds of sinfulness or wickedness, oh yeah, we're going to be lost. But all we need to remember is that you do not have to commit great acts of sinfulness in order to be lost. All you have to do is to do nothing. All we have to do is to do nothing. Someone said, and I don't know who it was now, but someone said the biggest cemetery in the world is the one where all the unused talents are buried. Indeed, that pretty much gets a lot of us, doesn't it? We have our abilities of God, and it doesn't matter again how much it is. We all have some abilities, but rather than using our abilities in service to God, we basically bury it, just like that cemetery. Or we bury our talents and do not use them. And when we give an account of our service to God, then God is going to look at our lives and call us worthless and unprofitable. You see, this parable calls for a committed, diligent service while the master is away. Yes, the master is away for a while, but one day he's coming back. And when he comes back, we're going to have to give an account. Are you diligently serving God? Or are you like the one talent man who's basically burying your talents and not using them at all? Religious indifference will cause us to be lost. Not using our abilities will cause us to be lost. God expects committed, dedicated, diligent service. Anything less than that is religious indifference, and God will not be satisfied with laziness. I hope then this would encourage each one of us to use our lives in service to God And don't use the excuse of thinking I'm a good person. No, if we're not using our abilities in service to God, and as far as God is concerned, we are not good people. We are worthless people. Thank you for your attention.